Today we're going to be talking about all of the latest OLED developments from LG Display for 2026. We'll look at their latest generation OLED technology, talk about the updated primary RGB Tandem 2.0 panels and what that means for the OLED display market. We'll also discuss what improvements and updates are being made for this year that we can look forward to in the future from their technology, and we'll look at both their TV panels as well as their monitor panels, before honing in a bit more on the monitor panels recently announced and those being developed for this year and beyond. Keep in mind we're talking here about LG Display, who are the panel manufacturer who make all of the WOLED technology panels used widely in the TV and monitor market, competing against Samsung Display, who make all of the QD-OLED panels. We'll talk about various display manufacturers who are using LG Display's panels as well, which includes LG Electronics, but also various others. One key change for this year is that LG Display are trying to move away from some of their more complex branding for their panels. Last year they talked about primary RGB Tandem technology, which has been updated this year and improved for 2026 to primary RGB Tandem 2.0. We'll explain that more in a minute. This year though, they're mainly trying to market their panels under the simpler umbrella brand of Tandem WOLED. Last year, the primary RGB part of the name represented the stacked OLED structure, in which three primary colour layers, red, green and blue, are layered independently in tiers, which was a change from their previous panel structure. The tandem part of the naming represented the fact that you had a red and a blue paired together and a green and a blue paired together in tandem. This year, LG Display will more widely use the simpler term Tandem WOLED, which we think makes it a bit easier and simpler. We did find last year, for instance, that the use of the term RGB led to some confusion in the market, when sometimes we'd also be talking about the layout of the subpixels, which are also divided up into RGB along with an added white subpixel, which were often in different orders and layouts. The primary RGB tandem naming was always related to the light emitting layers of the OLED material, not linked in any way to different pixel layouts or combinations. Note that Tandem WOLED refers to the technology used for their TV and monitor panels, where the W in WOLED stands for white, but it signifies the colour of the light produced by the OLED stack, as opposed to something like QD-OLED, for instance, which produces blue light. The white light is then passed through colour filters to produce red, green and blue and so on. We'll refer back to this later on when we're discussing some of the latest WOLED monitor panels, but for now it's useful to understand that the W in WOLED relates to the colour of the light produced by the OLED stack, and contrary to long-standing assumptions, it's nothing to do with the use of a white subpixel in the panel design. In contrast to WOLED, LG Display also produce what they simply call Tandem OLED, without the W in this instance, which is a technology used in small and medium-sized panels, such as for automotive, laptops and tablets. That technology features a structure where red, green and blue light can be emitted directly without the use of colour filters, and features a dual layer RGB element structure. For the purposes of this video, since we're talking about TV and monitor panels, we're interested in Tandem WOLED technology, as that's the only technology that's used in this segment. Having said all that then about the simplification of the branding and naming convention for this year, it's perhaps a little confusing that LG Display are also talking about primary RGB Tandem 2.0 and the enhancements to this year's technology. This is going to be featured in their latest Meta panels for 2026. I guess the continued use of the full technology name is useful in this transition period as we move into Tandem WOLED branding and away from the previous branding. And it's useful also to distinguish this year's updates from last year. So this year the latest panels will be Tandem WOLED with primary RGB Tandem 2.0 technology. The headline update this year is a further increase to the peak luminance spec of their flagship TV panels, pushing up from 4000 nits last year to 4500 nits this year, an increase of 12.5%. This also matches what Samsung Display are advertising with their 2026 QD-OLED technology panels. Along with the improvement in peak luminance spec, there's also decent improvements for other APL measurements, with an average 16% increase in specs across the APL range based on the known panel specs that we have at this time. LG Display has shared specs for 10% and 25% APL, but we don't have any specs yet for 100% APL full screen white although we expect this to be probably the same as last year's panels at 400 nits. Same with colour luminance, where we don't have a spec this time, probably indicating that it remains the same as last year. The improvements that we do know about for luminance are achieved through what LG Display say is an optimised pixel design along with advanced algorithms, which are what distinguishes primary RGB Tandem 2.0 from last year's 1.0 version. We should keep in mind that with all of these headline panel brightness specs from both LG Display and Samsung Display, the real-world performance from actual TVs can be somewhat different, especially when they're set to a normal colour temperature and not some overly cool or vivid preset mode that's designed to accentuate the brightness. We'll need to wait for further testing to understand how these headline specs translate into real-world performance across different TVs and panels in the future, but the early indication from side-by-side exhibitions at CES looked positive. Colour gamut remains the same as last year, which improved with a shift to a 4-layer structure which increased the colour purity. At the time, LG Display promoted a minor increase in the DCI-P3 spec from 98.5% to 99.5% coverage, which remains the same this year. But DCI-P3 is really a rather limited spec to rely on at this stage and doesn't fully reflect the improvements that we saw independently from testing. There was a decent increase, for instance, in the BT 2020 or Rec 2020 coverage from around 75% to around 83%, for instance, with the Tandem WOLED TV panels. This should open up support for wider colour spaces where needed for HDR and a more vivid, colourful and saturated image than previous WOLED panels. LG Display have also promoted what they call the visual superiority of their Tandem WOLED technology since last year. We already know that the black depth is superior to QD-OLED panels in brighter room environments, which is a well-known limitation with the competing Samsung Display technology. Although some improvements have been made this year with some of their latest QD-OLED monitor panels with an optimised panel design and film. Regardless, the WOLED panels retain their black depth better as ambient light increases, something that we've already seen on previous WOLED panels and measured in detail in the past, especially on their Tandem WOLED panels that we've tested over the last 6 months or so. In the TV space last year, LG Display also developed a special ultra anti-reflection filter for their TV panels that offsets both light reflected from the display's surface and light absorbed and reflected inside the panel. They say that the new panels can block 99% of internal and external light reflections, helping to realise perfect blacks whether you have the lights off or you're using the screen during the daytime in a bright room. This year, for their 2026 Tandem WOLED TV panels, the latest update is called Perfect Black Anti-Reflection, or Perfect Black AR for short, which also includes their new reflection-free premium finish. That's been updated for this year with the primary RGB Tandem 2.0 flagship panels, and they say that this now offers the world's lowest reflectance of 0.3% across consumer TV products. Other benefits that LG Display promoted last year, besides the brightness improvements, are around energy saving. By enhancing the 4th generation OLED TV panel structure and power supply system, they've reduced the panel temperature and achieved around a 20% greater energy efficiency than the previous generation. That's in the case of the 65-inch panel example at least. We haven't been given any additional information on any changes or updates for this year, but we'd expect it to remain the same as before, as this is just an evolution of those Tandem WOLED panels. The other ongoing promoted benefit of Gen 4 OLED is that LG Display are referring to this as human-friendly, with the panels being certified for low blue light levels, flicker-free operation and glare-free comfort. These are the same claims as last year, as their Tandem WOLED technology remains the same in these areas for 2026. They've also got a focus on the environmental impact of their products, and they're keen to highlight this. This shows their continued focus on eye health, biorhythms and the environment. So this year, the latest panel innovations can be divided up into these 3 areas. The optimized pixel design and advanced algorithms constitute the primary RGB Tandem 2.0 technology, while there's also some improvements to their perfect black AR coating and reflection handling. Pixel dimming and the human-friendly capabilities remain the same as last year. The new 2026 panels remain formally part of their 4th gen OLED, so think of this as an enhancement to last year's Gen 4 technology with the updates and the primary RGB Tandem 2.0 classification. We believe that the Meta generation is updated again this year to Meta 4.0, although this specific branding is not widely used or talked about. You can see the improvements made in various brightness specs across each WOLED generation here, along with a summary of the generations, years, and various technologies that have been used throughout each generation. In 2026, the updated Tandem WOLED TV panels with primary RGB Tandem 2.0 will be produced in 48, 55, 65, 77 and 83-inch size TV panels. So the smallest size that you'll find a Tandem WOLED TV panel in will remain 48 inches, but keep in mind that the use of these latest panels may vary between different TV manufacturers. Just because the panels exist doesn't necessarily mean that any 2026 TV model from a given manufacturer will feature it. We'll look to provide more detail in the coming months on specific TV launches and models of note that utilise the latest 2026 panels. Note that the popular C series in LG's OLED TV lineup, which will be C6 this year, does include a 42-inch sized option that some people like to use as a monitor, but that size will not feature a Tandem WOLED panel this year, unfortunately. Nor does LG Display actually even produce a Tandem WOLED panel in that size, sadly. That's the TV space then. What about desktop monitor panels? We'll talk about all the new 2026 panels in a moment, but before we do, it might be helpful to have a quick recap of the WOLED monitor panels that have been produced over the years, as this gives some context to some of the changes and updates this year. While LG Display don't really talk about panel generations for their monitors other than last year's Gen 4 panels, we've split them up here to logical generations, which we think makes life easier and simpler to follow. The first WOLED monitor panels were produced back in 2023 with a flat 27-inch 1440p panel that was used in loads of monitors at the time. They also produced a 45-inch ultra-wide curved panel that year that had a 3440 by 1440 resolution and a steep 800R curvature. We'll call these two panels Gen 1 as they were produced in that first year in 2023 and mark the first iteration of their OLED monitor technology. Micro lens array, or MLA, was always a feature of their WOLED monitor panels from the outset. That's used to help maximize the brightness on these smaller panels. In 2024, for what we'll call Gen 2, we saw several new panel options introduced by LG Display. Firstly, they upgraded their 27-inch 1440p panel to offer an improved peak brightness spec, up 30% and boosted now to 1300 nits instead of 1000 nits. They still refer to this as featuring MLA, so not their later MLA Plus technology, so there was no change to the actual structure of the panel, so it probably just represented either some panel optimization or perhaps a more bullish approach to brightness after a period of testing the market, balancing between longevity, lifespan, image retention, and panel brightness. At the same time as that brightness increase, they also made a glossy panel option available for that 27-inch panel. This was exclusively adopted by ASUS at the time for one of their monitors, and this was LG Display's first iteration of their glossy coating, which we'll call Glossy 1.0, as some changes have been made since, which we'll explain in a minute. They also introduced two new ultra-wide panels in sizes of 34-inch and 39 inches, both in Gen 2, with a 3440 by 1440 resolution again, and the same steep 800R curvature as their 45-inch panel. They also had the same 1300 nits peak brightness spec, but their steep curvature wasn't to everyone's liking, especially on the smaller 34-inch panel. Later in 2024, they made some fairly fundamental updates to their panels, with the introduction of a new 32-inch and 27-inch size panel with what we'll call Gen 3 because of this update. For those panels, they altered the subpixel layout to help improve the text clarity and reduce issues with fringing and text clarity that had affected previous WOLED panels. The pixel layout has changed as shown here to bring it closer to the expected layout of Windows, and this did a nice job of improving text clarity, especially where it was then combined with an increased pixel density and resolution like on the 32-inch panel. For Gen 3, the first new panel was a 32-inch 4K resolution panel with 140 ppi pixel density and 240 Hz refresh rate. As well as the improved pixel density, this was the first panel that they produced which featured a dual mode function as well, allowing you to double the refresh rate to 480 Hz if you were willing to drop to a lower 1080p resolution. LG Display call this technology Dynamic Frequency and Resolution, or DFR for short. Sometimes they just simply refer to it as performance mode, but either way, we think dual mode is probably the simplest way to describe this function. The other new Gen 3 panel was their new 27-inch 1440p panel with a very high 480Hz refresh rate, the fastest available at the time from any OLED panel, although that has been surpassed by some newer panels since. The other change for these two new panels was an update to use their MLA Plus technology, helping to maintain that 1300 nits brightness spec despite the higher pixel density on the 32-inch model and the higher refresh rate on the 27-inch model, both of which can have an impact on brightness normally. In 2025, they released several new panels, some of which we'll continue to refer to as Gen 3 panels, and then they also released the first of their Gen 4 Tandem WOLED panels. The first new Gen 3 panel to go into production in January was an updated 45-inch ultra-wide panel with a much higher 5120 by 2160 or 5K 2K resolution, increasing the pixel density significantly compared with the original Gen 1 panel from a couple of years before. This panel remains curved at 800R and it's available with a 165Hz refresh rate, which also supports dual mode function like on their 32-inch panel. Also of note last year was an update to the previous 32-inch 4K panel, which now offered a natively glossy version, which was adopted by some manufacturers, including ASUS for a couple of their models. LG Display produced a 240Hz and a 165Hz refresh rate version of this panel, both offering dual mode support as well. This new 32-inch panel option marked the introduction also of their new glossy 2.0 coating as well, which now offers a zero haze finish instead of the 3% haze that they had on their previous first iteration. That caused some minor visible grain on the image, which has now been cleared up. There were also some improvements to the reflection handling, with a 38% improvement quoted by some manufacturers. That new glossy coating option has been adopted by some display manufacturers already and marketed under different branding, like for instance ASUS's True Black Glossy and Gigabyte's recent Real Black Glossy. But it's the same underlying panel finish provided by LG Display, the panel manufacturer, just marketed in different ways. Note also that the matte anti-glare coating option on their monitor panels is slightly different to their TVs. We talked earlier about the 0.3% reflection spec of their latest 2026 Tandem WOLED TV panels, but in the monitor space, the reflection rating is slightly higher at 1.1%. Later in 2025, we saw the first Gen 4 primary RGB Tandem WOLED panels produced, and these were featured in several exciting monitors at the time. Two new monitor panels were introduced, both in 27-inch size, with a 2560 by 1440 resolution, but with different refresh rate options. The first Tandem WOLED monitor panel produced was a mid-tier 280Hz refresh rate that we saw introduced in several new monitors, including one from Gigabyte where the matte anti-glare coating version was used, and one from ASUS where the glossy 2.0 version was offered. The second new Tandem WOLED monitor panel produced a little later in the year was their flagship world's fastest OLED monitor panel, with a 540Hz native refresh rate and a dual mode function which offered an even higher 720Hz refresh rate when dropping down to a lower 720p resolution. The dual mode function seems to be becoming increasingly common across their panels, and we'd expect to see that used on most of, but not all of their new panels moving forward. Interestingly, LG Display now reference this 540Hz panel as featuring primary RGB Tandem 2.0 in their latest material from this year. So perhaps this second panel that was introduced last year had some further optimizations in order to meet the brightness specs. The 280Hz panel isn't referenced this year, so it's not entirely clear if LG Display would classify that as primary RGB Tandem 1.0 or 2.0, but it doesn't really make much difference to anything. Both of these new Tandem WOLED panels in 2025 offered significant improvements in brightness, black depth, and color gamut compared with earlier generations. The peak luminance spec has increased from 1300 nits to 1500 nits now, with improvements for 100% APL as well, from 275 nits to 335 nits. These changes also allowed the new Tandem WOLED panels to be certified for the first time under the VESA Display HDR 500 True Black tier, whereas all of the previous panels had only been certified under the True Black 400 tier. In practice, we also saw significant improvements to SDR luminance thanks to the new Tandem WOLED panels, with some even reaching up to around 380 nits, which was a big improvement over the typical 260 to 270 nits we'd seen before. Black depth was also improved thanks to what LG call ultimate reality in their monitor segment, and we saw excellent improvements to contrast and blacks in brighter room conditions especially, compared with earlier Gen WOLED panels. It also shows significantly better blacks than the competing QD-OLED panels as well. This was a noticeable change, and when those Tandem WOLED panels were combined with a glossy coating, you got the deepest blacks possible. Colour gamut has also increased, jumping from around 127% relative coverage of sRGB to around 153% with the new panels. This also offers over 99.5% absolute coverage of DCI-P3 and around 85% Rec 2020 coverage, up from around 74% coverage on the previous gen. This leads to more vivid and saturated colours in both SDR and HDR content and marked a significant improvement in WOLED technology. For 2026, we've already seen 3 exciting new monitor panels announced, all featuring the latest Tandem WOLED panels and utilising primary RGB Tandem 2.0. The first is a longer-awaited and exciting new 39-inch ultra-wide panel, which offers a 5K 2K resolution, a big step up in pixel density compared with their previous 39-inch panel. The updated pixel layout has also been used here, which further enhances text clarity, but best of all, we think, this new panel offers a more subtle 1500R curvature, as LG Display have listened to consumer and reviewer feedback and addressed this with their new panel. This one's got a 165Hz refresh rate and a dual mode function for 330Hz as well, and it's a Tandem WOLED panel, so it offers the same improvements to brightness, black depth and colours that we've talked about from their 27-inch panels from last year, including True Black 500 certification and a 1500 nits peak brightness. LG Display told us that from a panel point of view, they will now offer display manufacturers a choice between a matte anti-glare version and a glossy version of their panels, and this will apply across all of their other new 2026 panels. At the time of this video, only LG Electronics have so far announced any monitor using this new panel, and they've opted to use the matte anti-glare coating option. They've not got any plans for a glossy version themselves at this time, but maybe we'll see some other manufacturers like Asus or Gigabyte adopt this glossy version at some point. Another new panel update for this year is a refresh of their 32-inch 4K panel, which will be updated now to use their newer Tandem WOLED technology, offering all of the improvements to brightness, black depth and colours that we've talked about. Again, this will be available in matte and glossy varieties. Like the new 39-inch ultra-wide panel, only LG Electronics have so far announced any monitor using this new 32-inch panel, and their model will again use the matte coating option. The third known new panel for 2026 is a very interesting new 27-inch size panel, offering for the first time in WOLED technology a 4K resolution at this size, something that Samsung Display introduced last year in 2025 with their QD-OLED technology. This new panel will use Tandem WOLED again, but the most interesting thing about this new panel is the shift to a true RGB stripe subpixel layout, removing the white subpixel and therefore improving text clarity even further, as the layout now matches what Windows expects. That change, combined with the very high pixel density, will offer excellent picture quality and sharpness. Because of the removal of the white subpixel, we should expect some drop to the brightness specs. These are the specs that we've been told so far by LG Display, and at the moment the panel would be certified to the VESA Display HDR 400 True Black tier, but we are told that the panel is still being optimized and finalized for mass production, so this could potentially change by the time it gets released. Expect to see final brightness specs for this panel nearer to its release later in the year. So far, only Asus have announced a screen using this new 27-inch 4K panel with the glossy option selected by them for their monitor. That's due to be released in Q2 at the earliest. That covers all of the official, currently announced and known new panels for 2026. What about rumours or expected future panels? We've got a bit of information that we can share here, but please consider this as TBC at this stage, with all of the specs listed as our best guess expectations. There was some mention at CES this year that LG Display would be updating their recent 27-inch 540Hz panel from last year to offer a higher refresh rate from its dual mode function potentially. Currently it supports 720Hz at 720p, but that's only a 50% refresh rate bump compared with the native mode, despite having to sacrifice the resolution to a quarter as normal. Typically you get double the refresh rate for that resolution drop. With the arrival of various 1000Hz or higher LCD gaming monitors at CES this year, it suggested that the dual mode function of this OLED panel could also be increased to over 1000Hz, and we expect 1080Hz to be a likely figure, given that it would then be exactly double the refresh rate of the native mode. It's logical to expect that to just be a refresh of the existing panel with no further changes to the specs or features. Consider this a rumour for now though. From previous roadmap information we know there were plans to produce a 240Hz refresh rate version of their 45-inch 5K 2K ultra-wide panel at some point. That panel doesn't use Tandem WOLED, so it's unclear whether they'd bother to update that to the latest technology or whether they just stick with the panel structure from the previous panel. Our best guess is that if they did update this panel, it would just offer the same panel structure and technologies and the same curvature as their existing panel, just with a higher refresh rate. The current 165Hz panel hasn't been widely adopted though by display manufacturers, with only LG Electronics releasing one monitor so far with it. LG Display could potentially just leave it at that if it isn't proving popular and the niche is too small. The new 39-inch OLED panel for 2026 could also receive a 240Hz update in the future at some point. There was mention of this on some previous roadmaps that we'd seen, although again expect this to depend on the adoption and popularity of the first 165Hz panel that's being produced now. If it does get updated at some point, we'd expect everything else to match the panel being produced now. Somewhere down the line, we expect them to update the 34-inch ultra-wide panel to offer a higher 5K 2K resolution as well, and therefore a much higher pixel density, with the original plan suggesting that the mass production could be around the same time as their 39-inch panel. Although we expect that 39-inch panel has been the focus for now, while they also try and figure out the higher pixel densities. LG Display have only just managed to increase the pixel density to these kind of levels with their new 27-inch 4K panel that's going into mass production in Q2 2026, and so it's likely that the 34-inch 5K 2K ultra-wide panel has been delayed because of this. It's unclear at the moment what the curvature would be, but LG Display did suggest at CES that they'd be using the 1500R curve on all of their future ultra-wide OLED panels anyway. So we think that that's a safe bet for this monitor panel should they refresh it later on. We're not sure about the refresh rate of this. It could be 165Hz or 240Hz. Time will tell on that. One interesting consideration would be whether they utilise the new RGB stripe pixel layout for that new panel. Given that they've only produced one panel with this approximate pixel density so far, and that's used RGB stripe, it might suggest that their production capabilities would make that an easier approach than using RGWB. Time will tell on that 34-inch ultra-wide panel refresh. Related to that, we know from previous roadmaps that at some point they were planning to refresh their 32-inch 4K panel to an RGB stripe layout as well, although given that there's been an update this year for a Tandem WOLED panel, perhaps that's been abandoned or pushed back. So there you go, there's a rundown of all of the currently available and future WOLED monitor panels that we know about so far. Here's a handy reference table summary of all of the different panels, technologies, generations and specs. You can pause on this if you want to take in any of the information, of course. Remember that the generation naming is our own, apart from Gen 4, which they used last year, but we hope that makes things a little bit easier to follow. If you'd like to help support the content that we produce at TFT Central, you can find a link to our Patreon below, where you can also get various benefits like early access to new reviews and articles. Do let us know in the comments section if you're thinking of buying an OLED monitor this year or what you're most excited about in the OLED market right now. Thank you for watching. We'll catch you next time.